The Sixers jockey for playoff position. Highlights tonight.
Good evening, I'm Hugh Downs.
And I'm Barbara Walters. And this is 2020.
On the ABC News Magazine, 2020 with Hugh Downs and Barbara Walters. And worried when you hear that so many things can cause cancer? A renowned scientist says we've overdone the warnings, that there's been too much hype.
You get more carcinogen in a cup of coffee than you do in all the pesticide residues you eat in a day.
Have the experts been crying wolf? John Stossel takes a fresh look at many of the warnings we've heard before. Has it been much ado about nothing?
Warning, this next report may be hazardous to your beliefs. For 2 decades now, we in the media have brought story after story where experts warn of links between all kinds of pollutants and cancer. But tonight, a distinguished research scientist makes a case that many of the warnings we hear are unnecessary, that all the concern about this toxin and that pesticide is much ado about nothing. Wouldn't it be nice if he was right? Is he right? Has fear and hysteria replaced common sense? Well, John Stossel looks at the polluted world according to Dr. Ames.
It seems every day another chemical is linked to cancer.
Asbestos causes cancer.
That exposure to toxic chemicals
may be a leading cause of lung cancer.
Sometimes it makes you feel as if nothing is safe. But today, a number of well-respected scientists say this is nonsense.
We're the healthiest we've been in human history, and everybody's worrying.
Dr. Bruce Ames is one of the more outspoken scientists on the subject. At sedate scientific meetings, he often shocks his colleagues, saying things like,
The types of cancer that we're looking at have been around a long time, and there isn't any evidence that it's chemicals in the modern world that are causing all of this.
who is this man, and where does he get off making claims like that? Ames is probably best known for a test he invented, a test that gives scientists a cheaper and faster way to see if a chemical causes mutations, and therefore probably cancers. The traditional way to test a substance is to feed big doses of it to animals and wait to see if they get cancer or have babies with birth defects. But these tests can take 2 to 3 years and cost $100,000. So Dr. Ames said, instead of testing animals, why not test bacteria? You can study 1 billion of them on just one petri dish, and you don't have to wait long for the next generation. Bacteria reproduce every 20 minutes. The test proved successful. Since then, it's been hailed as a major scientific breakthrough. And today, worldwide, it's the standard test for seeing if chemicals cause mutations. It's called the Ames test, and its first use in the 70s showed carcinogens in hair dye and children's pajamas. Ames helped get the chemicals banned. But then continued testing led him to question those bans.
People started using our test and finding mutagens everywhere, in cups of coffee, on the outside of bread, and when you fry your hamburger, and a lot of these things turned out to be carcinogen. And so I started getting what I feel is a more realistic view of the whole world.
He concluded that the popular assumption that man-made chemicals are much more carcinogenic than natural substances is just wrong.
There's a whole movement of people who committed to the idea that man-made chemicals are causing a lot of cancer. It's just I don't think there's much science behind it. In fact, the science is all going the other way.
As evidence, he points to cancer rates. Thousands of new chemicals have been introduced over the past 40 years. If they were giving people cancer, says Ames, then there should be an epidemic of cancer in this country. But there isn't. It's true that lung and skin cancer have increased. But the American Cancer Society says that's because 20 or so years ago, more people started smoking and doing more sunbathing. Other forms of cancer, says the Society, have, on average, stayed pretty level. Ames says this is just more evidence that most industrial chemicals, most air pollution, most pesticides are no more carcinogenic than food we eat every day.
Practically everything in the supermarket, if you really looked at it at the part per billion level, would have carcinogens. Vegetables are good for you, yet vegetables make toxic chemicals to keep off insects. So every vegetable is 5% of its weight in toxic chemicals. These are nature's pesticides. Celery, alfalfa sprouts, and mushrooms are just chock full of carcinogens.
Over there it says organic produce. Is that better?
No, absolutely not, because the amounts of pesticide residues, man-made pesticide residues people are eating are absolutely trivial. They're very, very tiny amounts. You get more carcinogen in a cup of coffee than you do in all the pesticide residues you eat in a day.
In a cup of coffee? Where does he get that? Well, to put risks in perspective, Ames and his staff analyzed the results of every cancer test done on rats and mice. By comparing the dose that gave the rodents cancer to the typical exposure people are likely to get, they came up with a ranking of the dangers. Pesticides such as DDT and EDB came out much lower than herb tea and peanut butter. Alcohol was higher on the list, and so were mushrooms. These natural things, they are as carcinogenic as the chemicals that we're using? These incredibly powerful poisons are no worse?
Right. Yeah, so one raw mushroom gives you much more of carcinogens than any polluted water you're going to drink in a day.
So are you saying we shouldn't eat fresh produce?
No. Fresh produce is good for you. Here, I'll eat a raw mushroom even though it's full of carcinogens.
Now, many people listening to Ames conclude he's a nut. He's promoting a far-out minority viewpoint. Yet among serious scientists, it's not a minority viewpoint. Science magazine published his cancer rankings and published them only after other independent scientists scrutinized and approved his research. We went to even more experts. We showed samples of his writings to scientists at the American Cancer Society and the American Medical Association. It may surprise you that they said, yes, Ames is by and large right. The Environmental Protection Agency, which now is revising its cancer risk assessments, generally agrees with Ames too, though their spokesman was a little more critical.
I think Bruce Ames has a very important message. We don't know today what really causes cancer and what contributes to it. But it doesn't do anybody any good to oversimplify the thing, to say it's none of the pollution exposures that are a problem. I don't think the science supports that kind of a sweeping statement.
Ames agrees that his risk comparisons are imperfect because the animal research is imperfect. For one thing, the doses are extreme. That saccharin story was true. The rats got cancer only after drinking the equivalent of 800 cans of diet soda a day. At doses like that, lots of substances might cause cancer. So Ames says, don't worry about all these things. If you do, you're less able to focus on what's really dangerous. And what's that? Ames points to things like cigarette smoking, eating too much saturated fat, and as far as environmental threats, working with asbestos or living with radon.
Regulators ought to be working on important problems. So radon coming out of the ground, which is a radioactive gas, might be important. It might cause 10,000 cases of lung cancer a year, and probably want to work on that. And things that are maybe causing one case of cancer in the country, you don't want to work.
Does that mean we can only worry about one thing at a time? No. Shouldn't we try to get...
Oh, sure, we can worry about lots of things, but you always want to make lists of what's most important. People want no residue. Okay, well, again, getting nothing, it costs an enormous amount of money to get from this tiny amount to something even tinier to get something tinier. It's where do you stop? Where do you put your money, and how do you spend your money to get the most health increases for the dollar?
If what Ames says is true, it has enormous consequences for public policy. When we ban cyclamates, people eat more sugar. When we ban pesticides, insects destroy more of our crops, and food costs more. And sometimes the replacement pesticides prove even more dangerous. And what about when the government evacuates a town, like Times Beach, Missouri? Several years ago, the government shut the town down because traces of dioxin were found in the soil.
She doesn't quite understand what's happening to her life.
At great expense, emotional and financial, the residents were told to move. We reporters were confused about the extent of the danger. I reported in one of the dioxin dumping scares, and I was there walking around with the people who live there, and right next to us were the government employees in their spacesuits, carefully covered head to toe.
Well, they dress people up just to be... So again, you go to this extra prudence, and then everybody gets scared because somebody's in a spacesuit. If you relate how much dioxin are you getting into you relative to the amount that does something, it's still way less dangerous as causing birth defects than a beer.
Now the EPA says dioxin may be 16 times less dangerous than they thought during the Times Beach scare. And what about the well-publicized case of Woburn, Massachusetts? Local chemical companies were accused of dumping TCE in the drinking water. Around that time, 16 children got leukemia.
I need to go in the hospital a lot of times and get IVs.
Robbie and 6 others died.
Well, what about these clusters of cancer around?
But that can, so they're clusters of anything, but some of that, most of that's just due to chance. And so you can take any census district in the United States, it's in high in something. There's so many different kinds of birth defects of cancer just by chance thing. So for example, the number of storks in Europe has been going down for years. The birth rate's going down for years. If you plot one against another, it's a beautiful correlation, but it doesn't mean storks babies.
If there was more leukemia around Woburn, Massachusetts, it doesn't mean that the...
Right. The water in Woburn, Massachusetts was safer than ordinary tap water.
It was never proven that the chemicals in the water caused the leukemia. But when the Woburn family sued the W.R. Grace Company, saying it was responsible for the pollution, Grace avoided a trial by paying them a reported $8 million.
Why do the companies pay?
There are always people willing to say and make good money that, yes, that part per billion caused that lady's cancer, and there's a whole group of professional witnesses that will do that. And juries tend to go to the big pockets. So if there's a company and there's somebody who has a case of leukemia, oh, well, the company can afford it.
And then there's the most famous case, Love Canal in upstate New York.
Quit using me as a guinea pig. Let me get my family out of there.
Everyone was certain that toxic waste there had already caused birth defects and cancer. Houses were bulldozed. The government moved everyone away from the dump. But several years later, the Center for Disease Control did a more scientific assessment of the dangers and said the cancer rates of Love Canal residents were no higher than average. It did say the studies should continue.
How do you know that 20 years from now there aren't going to be real chemical clusters, cancer clusters around chemicals from these
because we're so much, I mean, modern life is so much safer than life. People forget back in 1900 they have this view of idyllic life, but the streets were full of horse manure and there was dirty smoke pouring out of chimneys everywhere, and people were dying at age 40. I mean, we're so healthy and life is so clean compared to what it used to be. And a lot of that healthiness is due to modern technology.
This is why some of your critics say he's in bed with industry.
Now, I made it a policy not to consult. I don't get any money from industry. I don't testify at law case.
But you always take industry's side.
Well, in this case, I think the science is right, that they're being blamed for a lot of things that they didn't do.
Ames is fighting a lonely and unpopular battle. Although many scientists agree with him, most of them keep fairly quiet about it. His opponents, environmentalists and consumer advocates, get much more media attention. And it's doubtful that Ames will ever convince them. Speaking for the Sierra Club, Carl Pope.
There are lots of natural carcinogens, as Dr. Ames says. But there's no reason to load the system up with lots of new ones. Once you know this stuff causes cancer, you ought to be careful with it. You shouldn't use it where you don't need to, and you ought to warn people.
And that's counterproductive, because then it gives people the wrong message, and they'll be sitting worrying all the time. You're not going to rid the world of carcinogens because there are just way too many everywhere.
John, I must say I found this report amazing. I mean, if the American Cancer Society and the AMA, for example, agree pretty much with Dr. Ames, why is this such news?
Yeah, I was astounded to find how much agreement there was. I think we in the press, many of us have been irresponsible about these things. We consumer reporters especially often report on a scientist's accusation that this substance causes cancer and make a big scare story out of it without really checking to see how good the research was.
Well, does that mean that we don't worry about anything? I mean, you know, those of us who are eating organic food and don't want to eat a sprayed apple or something, we don't worry about anything?
No, I don't think Ames is saying that. He's just saying we should make rational decisions about this. Certainly radon, working with asbestos is dangerous, but before we decide where we're going to spend our money, we should look at these things not emotionally, but based on what the science really is.
Well, it's news to me, and I'm sure it is